Owen Carr is my name, and I've sent this account to 3 people I trust. 2 of them stopped responding after they read it. The third called me and said I should see someone. I'm telling you anyway, because one of the rules exists because of what I did, and you deserve to know which one. I'm a wildlife photographer. That's the simplest way to say it. I work on contract, mostly for conservation nonprofits and the occasional natural history publication. And what that means in practice is that I spend a significant portion of my life sitting very still in places most people would not choose to sit. Before dawn, usually. In the dark, in cover, with a camera and a lens that cost more than my first car, waiting for an animal to do something I can capture before the light changes. It's not glamorous work. The gear is heavy. The hides smell like old canvas and whatever the ground has been doing for the last several seasons. You eat cold food because heat creates scent. You don't move, sometimes for hours, because movement is information and you are trying to be invisible.
The cold gets into your hands first, then your knees, and eventually you stop noticing it the way you stop noticing a sound that's been going on too long. I have spent enough time in hides that I have become, over the years, very good at not noticing things. What you gain in exchange for all of that is this. There are moments, rare ones, where an animal moves through your frame in a way that feels like something being said. Not to you specifically, just said. The way a thing is said when no one is listening. And you happen to be there with the shutter open. And for a fraction of a second, the world makes a kind of sense it doesn't make anywhere else. I have been chasing that fraction of a second for 11 years. The Kenai contract came through a nonprofit called the Refuge Documentation Project, based out of Anchorage. 6 weeks, base camp assignment in the southern drainage of the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. Primary subject matter: moose and brown bear movement corridors through the sedge meadow systems along the glacial river bars. The pay was modest. The location was remote. The nearest town was a float plane ride away across 50 miles of roadless country. I took it the same afternoon I got the offer. I didn't negotiate. I didn't ask questions I should have asked. I just said yes, and booked my flight to Anchorage before the project coordinator finished explaining the gear requirements. That should tell you something about where I was at the time.
I left photojournalism in March of the year before the Alaska contract. That's the clean version of how I say it. The actual version is that I was pulled from the field rotation after an incident review board found that my conduct during the Diyarbakir building collapse in southeastern Turkey had been, their word, inappropriate. What that meant was this. A 6-story residential building came down at 4:47 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was 40 minutes away on another assignment when the alert came through. I got there before the first rescue crews. There were survivors in the rubble. I could hear them. 3 of them were close enough to the surface that I could see where the debris was moving. I shot for 41 minutes before I put the camera down and started pulling at concrete with my hands. The images ran on the wire the next morning. My editor called them the most important work of my career. 2 of them were submitted for awards. 1 won something. The review board's concern was not the awards. Their concern was the 41 minutes. I don't have a defense for the 41 minutes. I've tried to construct one and I can't. The honest answer is that I was in the frame. I was working. And when you're working, the frame is the whole world. Everything outside it stops being real in the same way. I have been a photographer long enough that this is not a choice I make. It is just what happens. My wife Elena understood this about me for 12 years. Then she didn't anymore. And I can't say she was wrong. My daughter Mara was 9 when I left Turkey. She is 11 now. The last time I spoke to her, she asked me if I was coming home for her school play. I said I'd try. I did not try hard enough. That was 14 months before Alaska, and I had not said her name out loud since,
because saying it required thinking about the expression on her face when I didn't show up. And I wasn't ready to do that. That is why I took a job that required a float plane to reach and had no cell service and kept me outdoors for 14 hours a day in country so large and indifferent that a person could stop being a person in it.
That is why I took a job that required a float plane to reach and had no cell service and kept me outdoors for 14 hours a day in country so large and indifferent that a person could stop being a person in it and just become a set of eyes attached to a camera. I told myself it was about getting back to the work, the real work, the kind that didn't require me to point a lens at human suffering and make a frame out of it. That part was true. It just wasn't the whole truth.
The float plane landed on a gravel river bar at 6:20 in the morning, 2 hours after leaving Soldotna. The pilot's name was Doug. He said 4 words the entire flight. Weather's holding, good luck. And I respected him enormously for it. The keen eye from the air is not what I expected, which is embarrassing to admit because I'd done the research. I knew the scale of it on paper. But knowing a number, 2 million acres, and then looking down at 2 million acres of unbroken boreal forest and glacial river system from a small plane at dawn are 2 completely different experiences. There is no edge to it. You look in every direction and the land just continues. Dark spruce giving way to pale sedge meadow, giving way to the gray-green braid of the river, and then more spruce, and then more meadow. And at no point does anything suggest that any of it was arranged with you in mind. Doug put us down on a gravel bar about 30 meters wide, flanked on both sides by the river's current braids, and helped me unload my gear without ceremony.
The gravel was the color of old bone, smoothed by water into shapes that had nothing sharp left in them. The air smelled like glacial cold and wet sedge, and something mineral and faintly sweet that I later learned was the specific smell of alder in early September, when the leaves are just beginning to turn but haven't committed to it yet. Vera Solis was waiting at the tree line. She was shorter than I expected, and completely still in a way that read immediately as deliberate. Not tense, still. The kind of stillness that takes practice. She was wearing a field jacket the color of dried grass and carrying a radio clipped to her chest, and she watched me struggle with the equipment cases across the gravel without offering to help, which I also respected, because I didn't need help, and she had apparently already figured that out. She said, "Car." Not a question. I said yes. I noticed later that it was the only time she used my last name. After that first morning, she used nothing at all. She turned and walked into the spruce line without checking whether I followed. I followed. The walk to base camp took 22 minutes. I know because I timed it out of habit. The trail, if you could call it that, ran through a narrow corridor of white spruce and then opened into a sedge meadow system that stretched maybe 400 meters to the next tree line. And the light was doing something extraordinary across the top of the sedge. The low September sun turning every stem into a filament of copper and pale gold, and I stopped walking to look at it without thinking about it. Vera stopped too. Not to look, just to wait for me to be done.
The base camp was a 3-tent setup at the edge of the meadow, where the spruce began again. A large canvas wall tent for sleeping and equipment storage, a smaller cook tent, and a weatherport shelter for the camera gear. Everything was clean and organized, in a way that suggested Vera had been here long enough to develop a system, and short enough that the system hadn't started to decay. There was a propane stove, a folding table with a laminated topo map of the drainage, an equipment board on the wall tent's interior frame, hung with color-coded stuff sacks and 2 radios on charging mounts. And on the equipment board, below the radios, a laminated sheet in a plastic sleeve. I didn't read it that first morning. I noticed it and moved on. There was gear to unpack, and I wanted to get a pre-sunset scout in before the light was gone. What I did notice on the walk from the river bar was the sedge meadow, specifically the trails through it. Moose trails, pressed flat by repeated passage, running in clean lines through the sedge from the tree lines on the north and east sides. 6 of them, maybe 7, converging toward the center of the meadow from different angles. Animals that know a place well don't stop a trail arbitrarily. Trails stop when the place they lead to is somewhere the animal has decided not to go. None of them continued on the other side. I noted it and filed it under things to investigate later, which is what I do with details that don't fit neatly into the picture I already have. It took me longer than it should have to stop doing that.
Vera ran the camp the way certain people run things. Not with authority, exactly, but with a settled certainty that made authority unnecessary. She knew where everything was. She knew the weather patterns for this drainage by the way the light changed over the north spruce line in the hour before sunset. She knew which sedge corridors the moose used at which times of day, with the precision of someone who had watched them long enough that their movements had become as legible as a schedule. She had been coming to this camp for 3 seasons. Before that, 2 seasons at a similar setup in the Togiak Refuge further west. Before that, a graduate research position in the boreal systems of northern Manitoba. She told me all of this in the first week, not as biography, but as context. The way you'd explain the history of a tool before handing it to someone who needed to use it. She cooked well. That surprised me. Not elaborate food. The camp ran on what the supply drops brought every 10 days. But she applied the same attention to a camp meal that she applied to everything else. And eating food that someone had paid genuine attention to is a different experience than eating food that was just prepared. I noticed this on the 3rd night, and did not mention it, because mentioning it seemed like the wrong register for the dynamic we had established. She did not ask me why I had left photojournalism. She did not ask about Elena or Mara. She did not ask about Turkey. I don't know if she had read my file or simply didn't consider it relevant. But either way, I was grateful in a way I could not have explained without admitting things I wasn't ready to admit. What she did ask on my 2nd morning was whether I had read the rules sheet. I said I'd glanced at it. She said, "Read it properly. Then we'll talk." I read it that afternoon, sitting at the folding table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I was looking at the laminate. I read all 5 rules, twice. Then I looked up at Vera, who was re-spooling a motion sensor cable across the tent floor without looking at me. I said, "Some of these are unusual." She said, "Yes." I said, "Rule 5 especially. That's not a safety protocol." She looked up then. Not quickly. She just redirected her attention from the cable to me the way she redirected it from one task to the next, with the same level of investment in both. She said, "All 5. Every shift. No exceptions." Then she went back to the cable.
That was the whole conversation. I sat with the laminated sheet in my hand and watched her work, and tried to identify what was bothering me about her response. And what I eventually landed on was this: she hadn't explained any of them. Not one. Most people, handed a list of unusual instructions, feel a social obligation to contextualize at least the strangest ones. Vera felt no such obligation. The rules did not require her endorsement. They simply were, the way the weather patterns over the North Spruce line simply were, and she expected me to treat them accordingly. I found this deeply unsettling. In a way I immediately explained away as culture clash. She was a field researcher, I was a contractor. We had different relationships to protocol.
What I didn't examine was this. She had recited all 5 rules from memory before I read the sheet, word for word. I only realized this later, comparing her recitation to the laminate. There was not a single deviation, not a word out of place. 3 seasons is a long time to have memorized something that precisely. I should have asked her why. I didn't ask her why. That is one of the things I am telling you about.
The laminated sheet had been re-laminated at least once over an older version. I know this because when I held it at an angle to the light coming through the tent door, I could see the ghost of the previous text underneath the current one. Not readable, just the impression of it. The slight raised texture of older ink under newer laminate. Someone had updated the rules at some point, or replaced them. The sheet itself was the 3rd or 4th generation of something that had been here longer than the current laminate suggested. The ghost text had the same line spacing as the current text. Whoever had updated the rules had kept the same layout. They had not needed to add lines, just change them. The plastic sleeve it lived in was newer than the sheet, cleaner, stiffer, the kind you buy in bulk from an office supply store. But the sleeve had been taped to the equipment board with a strip of aluminum riggers tape that had aged to the color of old pewter, and the tape's edges had the particular curl of something that had been through multiple freeze-thaw cycles. That tape had been there for years. Whatever was in the sleeve had been changed.
The sleeve itself had not. I stood at the equipment board for longer than I meant to, looking at it. Then I took it down and sat at the folding table and read it the way Vera had told me to. Properly. All 5. Twice. My first reaction was professional. The first 2 rules were wildlife safety protocol rendered in slightly unusual language. Don't pursue a spooked animal. Leave by the marked route. Unusual phrasing, but a recognizable underlying logic. I'd worked in enough remote locations that this kind of localized safety documentation didn't surprise me. Rules 3 and 4 were where the professional read started to strain. Standing at the perimeter, creating a presence that could be read from outside? That wasn't wildlife language. Wildlife didn't read presences. And the instruction about the equipment outside the perimeter? Photograph it, log it, leave it. The equipment is not the point of the rule. That last line was doing something the first 4 rules weren't. It was acknowledging that whoever followed the rule would want to know why, and it was declining to say.
Rule 5 I read 3 times. If you begin to feel that the work is going badly, that the animals are avoiding you specifically, that your presence in the field is somehow wrong, report it to the senior researcher immediately. Do not spend additional time in the field alone trying to correct it. This feeling is not about the work. I put the sheet down on the table. I picked up my coffee. It was cold. I drank it anyway. The thing about Rule 5 was that I had been feeling exactly that since my 3rd day in the field. Not strongly, not in a way I could point to and say, there, that is the thing that is wrong. Just a low, persistent sense that the drainage was not responding to me the way it should. That the animals were present. I could read the sign, the tracks, the compressions in the sedge, but were consistently just outside the range I needed. Not spooked, just absent from my frame in a way that felt less like bad luck and more like a decision someone had made on my behalf. I had not reported this to Vera.
I had told myself it was early season adjustment, that the wildlife needed time to habituate to a new presence in the corridor, that 6 weeks was long enough to turn it around. The rule said report it immediately. I folded the professional explanation back over the top of that and left it there. I put the sheet back in its sleeve. I went to find Vera and told her I'd read it properly.
She was outside, checking the motion sensor on the east stake. She looked up when I came out. I said, "I read it." She said, "All 5?" I said, "Yes." She nodded and went back to the sensor. I stood there for a moment. Then I said, "The previous version, under the laminate, do you know what was different?" She didn't look up. She said, "1 rule became 2. I waited for more. There was no more. She finished with the sensor and walked back past me into the tent, and I stood outside in the September light and listened to the sedge moving in the drainage below the camp, and thought about which rule had been split in 2, and why, and what had happened to make that necessary. I didn't ask. That is the other thing I am telling you about. Let me give you the rules the way Vera gave them to me, without explanation, without apology, in the order they appear on the sheet. Rule 1. If you hear someone calling for help from outside the camp perimeter after sunset, do not respond and do not approach the boundary. Return to the main tent, log the time and direction of the sound, and remain inside until first light. If the call sounds like someone you know, log that specifically. Do not go out for any reason. The first time I read that, I thought, remote camp, solo operators, hallucinations from isolation and cold are documented phenomena. This is a protocol for managing psychological stress in the field. Reasonable. Slightly overwritten, but reasonable. The phrase that didn't flatten was, if the call sounds like someone you know. That's not a hallucination protocol. Hallucination protocols don't make that distinction. Hallucination protocols don't need to, because a hallucination by definition sounds like something your mind produces, and your mind produces the voices of people you know. If the rule needed to specify that case separately, it was because someone had experienced it as a separate case. Someone had heard a stranger's voice and followed the rule correctly, and then heard a familiar voice and needed to be told again. I filed that thought and moved on. Rule 2. When working a hide before dawn, if an animal you have been tracking stops moving and orients toward you before you have made any sound, pack your equipment, leave the hide, and return to camp by the marked route only. Do not attempt to identify what caused the reaction. Do not look back while walking. This one I understood immediately as wildlife protocol, predator behavior. If a bear or a moose locks onto your position in a hide before you've given yourself away, something else has given you away, and you leave before the situation develops. Clean, logical, the kind of rule that exists because someone learned it the hard way in the field and wrote it down so the next person wouldn't have to. The detail that caught me was, do not look back while walking. That's not in any wildlife safety protocol I've read. Wildlife safety tells you to make yourself large, make noise, back away slowly while facing the animal. It does not tell you to walk away without looking back. That instruction is for a different kind of encounter than the one the rule's first sentence describes. Rule 3. Do not stand at the camp perimeter after dark. If you need to check the boundary, use the motion sensors from inside the tent. Standing at the edge, even inside the line, creates a presence that can be read from outside. This is the one rule that has no exception. That last sentence, I read it 4 times. Every other rule on the sheet has an implied exception, a circumstance where judgment might override protocol. This rule closes that door explicitly. Someone had tried to argue an exception to this rule once, or had found a circumstance that felt like it warranted one, and the rule had been rewritten to preempt that argument. The sentence was added after the fact. I could feel it.
Rule 4. If you find a piece of equipment outside the perimeter that you did not place there,
a lens cap, a tripod foot, anything with the camp's marking tape, do not retrieve it. Photograph it from inside the line. Log its position. Leave it. The equipment is not the point of the rule. I spent more time on this one than any of the others, except Rule 5. The equipment leaving the perimeter implied something capable of moving objects across a boundary. The instruction to photograph and log it implied this had happened enough times to require a documentation procedure. And that last line, the equipment is not the point of the rule, was the most unsettling thing on the sheet. Because it meant that someone reading the rule might be tempted to think the rule was about the equipment.
The rule was written to correct that temptation in advance. If the equipment is not the point, then the point is something else entirely. The point is what happens when you cross the line to retrieve it. Rule 5. If at any point during your contract you begin to feel that the work is going badly, that you are not getting the shots, that the animals are avoiding you specifically, that your presence in the field is somehow wrong, report it to the senior researcher immediately. Do not spend additional time in the field alone trying to correct it. This feeling is not about the work. I have thought about this rule every day since I left Alaska. It is not a safety protocol. It is not wildlife guidance. It is a description of a specific experience written by someone who had that experience and survived it and needed the next person to recognize it before it was too late. The feeling is not about the work. Someone had to learn that. Someone had to be far enough into the feeling, far enough into the alone time spent trying to correct it, before they understood what it actually was. And they got out, and they rewrote the rule so the next person would understand sooner. I read that rule on my 8th day at the Kenai camp. I had been feeling it since day 3. I put the sheet back in its sleeve. I went and found Vera and told her I'd read all 5 properly. I did not tell her about day 3. I told myself I would tell her later, when I had more to report. Something concrete, something I could point to. The review board's word was inappropriate. What they meant was that I had kept working when I should have stopped. I recognized the pattern, and I kept working anyway. Later came. I did not tell her. That is the thing I am confessing to you. That is the rule I broke before I ever broke a rule.
The first 3 weeks were the best work I'd done in years. I want to say that clearly because it matters to what came after. The Kenai was not a consolation prize. It was not a lesser version of the work I'd left behind. It was the thing itself, the fraction of a second, over and over, in country that had no interest in being photographed, and therefore gave you something true every time it allowed it. The sedge meadow at dawn was different from any meadow system I'd worked before. The light came in at such a low angle in September that for the first 40 minutes after sunrise, the entire surface of the sedge was backlit, every stem luminous, and the animals moving through it appeared as dark shapes against that luminosity. Clean, graphic, the kind of image that requires no processing decision, because the world has already made every compositional choice for you. I shot a cow moose and her calf moving through the north corridor on my 4th morning, and knew before I reviewed the card that I had something that would matter. I told Vera at breakfast. I turned the camera toward her and showed her the back of the screen. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "She uses that corridor every 3rd day." I said, "How long have you been tracking her?" She said, 2 seasons. I said, "Does she have a name?" She said, "No." She went back to her coffee. I went back to mine. Outside the cook tent, the sedge was moving in a light wind off the river, and the spruce line was doing the thing it did in early morning, where the individual trees became indistinguishable from each other, and the whole line looked like a single continuous dark mass,
I sat there and felt, for the first time in longer than I could accurately measure, that I was in the right place, doing the right thing.
The days had a rhythm that I settled into without effort. Pre-dawn start, 2 hours in the hide before the light shifted, back to camp for food and card review, out again in the late afternoon for the second movement window. Back at dusk, log the day's observations, eat whatever Vera had put together, sleep. Vera's cooking was a genuine surprise every time. She worked with the same 10 ingredients in different configurations, and somehow the configurations kept being different in ways that mattered. I mentioned this once, that the food was good, and she looked at me with an expression I couldn't read and said, "It's just camp food." Which was not the point I was making, but I let it go. We talked more in the second week than the first. Not about personal things, about the drainage, the wildlife corridors, the specific behavior patterns she documented over 3 seasons. She had theories about the moose movement system that were more sophisticated than anything in the published literature on the Kenai herds, and she laid them out with the same flat precision she applied to everything. And I found myself genuinely engaged in a way I hadn't been in a long time with someone else's thinking. One evening, she told me about a bull moose she'd tracked in her first season. A large animal, unusual antler configuration that had used a corridor no other moose used, running along the south edge of the meadow close to the camp perimeter. She'd photographed him 12 times over 6 weeks. On the last day of her first season, she'd gone to the south corridor hide at dawn, and he wasn't there. She checked the corridor every morning for the rest of the contract. He didn't come back. I asked if she'd seen him in subsequent seasons. She said no. I asked if she knew what happened to him. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I stopped using the South Corridor hide after the first season." I waited for more. She picked up her mug and looked at the tent wall. I logged the day's observations and went to sleep. The thing I noticed and explained away came on day 19. I was reviewing cards from the morning hide, the North Corridor. A good session. 3 separate animals in good light, and I checked my position log against the sedge compression patterns I'd mapped in the first week. The hide I'd been using for 6 sessions showed no compression in the sedge around it. Not reduced compression. None. The sedge around my regular position was standing at full height, undisturbed, as if I had never sat in it. I checked my boots, I checked my gear bag. I went back out to the hide position and stood in it and pressed my boot into the sedge deliberately and watched the stems compress under my weight. And when I lifted my boot, the stems rose back to full height immediately. Not gradually, immediately. Sedge doesn't do that. I went back to camp and told myself the variety in that section had a higher stem density and more resistance to compression. I told myself the September growth had rebounded between sessions. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation and that I would look it up when I had internet access. I did not tell Vera.
The trigger happened on my 22nd day, before dawn, in the North Corridor hide. I had been in position since 5:10 a.m. The light was still 40 minutes out, full dark, the sedge invisible beyond the range of my headlamp, which I had off. I was running on the ambient light from a clear sky and the specific quality of pre-dawn that serious field photographers learn to use. The gray that isn't gray. The light that has no source, but exists anyway. The bull I'd been tracking for 9 days was moving. I could hear him. The specific sound of a large animal in sedge. The soft compression of stems under hooves. Rhythmic, unhurried. He was north of me, maybe 60 meters, moving east along the corridor the way he'd moved every morning I tracked him. I had the 500mm on the body, mirror locked, waiting for the light to build enough to give me something usable. He stopped. Not the gradual slowing of an animal that has found something to eat or has been distracted by a sound. A complete stop. mid-stride. The way an animal stops when something has registered in its threat assessment and its entire system has gone to evaluation mode. I had made no sound. I was certain of that. I had been in this hide enough times that my stillness was not effort anymore. It was just the state I entered when I sat down in the dark with a camera. He turned. Not toward the sound I hadn't made. Toward me. His head came around to face my position directly, and even in the pre-dawn gray, I could see the orientation of it. Ears forward, nose working, the full attention of a 1,200-pound animal directed at the exact point where I was sitting. I did not move. He stood like that for 4 minutes. I know because I was watching the seconds on my camera display. The only thing I allowed myself to move. My eyes, from the viewfinder to the display and back.
4 minutes and 11 seconds of a bull moose standing in the pre-dawn dark with his full attention on a hide that should have been invisible and had been invisible for 9 days of use. Then, I packed my equipment. I did it slowly, the way the rule implied. No sudden movement, no sound. Lens off the body, into the case. Body into the bag. Bag closed. I stood up. I oriented south toward the marked route back to camp. I did not look back. The walk back took 14 minutes. I know because I timed it. The marked route ran south through a narrow spruce corridor and then along the east edge of the sedge meadow to the camp tree line, and I walked it at a pace that was not running, but was faster than I normally walked. And I kept my eyes on the path ahead, and I did not look back. I did not hear anything behind me. That was almost worse. Back at camp, I unclipped my gear at the equipment board and sat down at the folding table and wrote the log entry. Bull moose, North Corridor, 5:47 a.m. Stopped and oriented toward hide position before any sound made. Rule 2 applied. Returned by marked route, no incident. Vera came out of the sleeping tent at 6:15. She poured coffee, brought me a cup without asking, and read the log over my shoulder. She set her own cup down. She read it again. She said, "Which animal?" I described him. The size, the antler configuration, the corridor he'd been using. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's used that corridor for 2 seasons." I said, "Since when does he orient toward hides?" She picked up her coffee. She looked at the tent wall, the same direction she'd looked when she told me about the South Corridor bull in her first season. She said, "Log it exactly as it happened." I said, "I did." She nodded. She took her coffee outside. I sat at the folding table and listened to her boots on the ground outside, and thought about the South Corridor bull that had stopped coming back, and the hide where the sedge didn't compress, and the 9 days this animal had moved through that corridor without incident before this morning. And I tried to build a rational structure that held all of those things together without requiring me to take the laminated sheet off the equipment board and read Rule 5 again. The structure I built was thin. It held for the rest of that day. By the following morning, it had developed gaps I couldn't close. I did not tell Vera about the sedge. The 9th night, I heard it for the first time. I was in the sleeping tent, in my bag, not asleep. The Kenai at night has a specific sound profile that I had learned over 3 weeks. The river, distant but constant. A low, broad sound like white noise with texture. The sedge in wind, a dry susurration that rose and fell. The occasional crack of a spruce branch contracting in the cold.
I knew all of these sounds the way you know the sounds of a house you've lived in. Not consciously, just as the background against which anything different would register. What I heard at 11:47 p.m. was different. A voice. Male. Coming from the south.
Beyond the camp perimeter, at a distance I estimated as 30 to 40 meters past the boundary line. Calling for help. One call. Conversational volume. The word help, delivered with the flat affect of someone who had been calling for a long time and had stopped expecting a result. I lay still. I looked at my watch. I started counting. At 2 minutes and 40 seconds, silence. No second call.
I got up, sat at the folding table, and wrote the log entry. Male voice, south perimeter, 11:47 p.m. Single call. Rule 1 applied. No follow-up. I wrote the direction, the estimated distance, the volume, the affect. I wrote everything the rule said to log. Then I sat there and listened to the river and the sedge and the spruce and thought about a man standing 30 meters past the camp boundary in the dark, calling for help in a voice that had given up on being answered. Vera's light came on in the sleeping tent. She appeared in the cook tent doorway 30 seconds later, fully dressed, radio in hand. She looked at me. She looked at the log. She said, "South." I said yes. She sat down across the table from me and read the entry. Then she picked up her radio and ran a check on the perimeter sensors. East, west, north, south. All registering. Nothing had crossed the boundary. She put the radio down. I said, "Someone could be out there." She said, "No." I said, "You can't know that." She looked at me with the same flat attention she gave everything. She said, "I've heard it 6 times across 3 seasons. Nothing is ever out there." I sat with that. Outside, the sedge was moving in a light wind. The river ran. Nothing called again. I said, "What is it?" She said, "I don't know." I said, "You've been here 3 seasons and you don't know?" She said, "Knowing what it is isn't the point of the rules." She went back to the sleeping tent. I sat at the table until 2 a.m. and then went back to my bag and lay there until dawn. On the 14th night, it used my name. I was at the table reviewing cards when it came from the south again. Same distance, same flat affect. Not help this time. Owen. Just that. Once. In a male voice I did not recognize. I logged it. Rule 3, I noted. Above my name in the log, I wrote Rule 1 applied, then corrected myself. Rule 1 covered the perimeter. Rule 3 covered hearing your name. I had heard my name. I logged both. Vera read it in the morning and said nothing. On the 17th night, it used a phrase. I was already awake when it came. I had stopped sleeping well by the second week of calls, which I had also not reported to Vera, which was a second violation of Rule 5 stacking on top of the first. The voice came from the south at 12:22 a.m. Male, same distance. Owen. A pause, and then, "You left your light on." 4 words, a sentence, a specific sentence. "You left your light on" was what Mara said every night when she was small, when I was home, which was not often enough, when she came to find me working late in my office. She would appear in the doorway in her pajamas and say it with the particular gentle accusation of a child who was woken up and found the house not fully dark and come to investigate. "You left your light on, Dad."
and I would close the laptop and take her back to bed. I had not told anyone at the Kenai that sentence. I had not told anyone that sentence in years, because there was no one left to tell it to. I logged the time, the direction, the words, exactly as spoken. My handwriting was even. I checked it twice because I wanted to be sure it was even. In the morning, I put the log in front of Vera without speaking. She read it. She looked up at me. She said, "It's learning you." I said, "What does that mean?" She looked at the equipment board, at the laminated sheet. She said, "You know what it means." I sat across the table from her and looked at the woman who had memorized 5 rules, word for word, across 3 seasons of hearing something in the dark learn the people it was listening to. And I understood for the first time that her certainty was not knowledge. It was the thing you build in place of knowledge when knowledge is not available, and you still have to get up every morning and go to work. I said, "Has it ever used your name?" She was quiet for a long moment. She said, "Yes." She did not say what it had used. I did not ask. That is the last thing I am telling you I failed to ask. The calls came every night after that. Always from the south. Always after midnight. Always my name first, and then something else. A fragment, a detail, a specific piece of a life I had not described to anyone in this drainage. The smell of Elena's coat. The name of the street we lived on. The sound Mara made when she laughed, which is not something you can describe, and which the voice did not describe. It produced it. At 1:17 a.m. on the 23rd night, 30 meters past the south perimeter in the dark, something produced the exact sound of my daughter laughing. I wrote it in the log. My handwriting was not even that time. Vera read the entries every morning. She did not comment on them. She ran the sensor checks, confirmed the perimeter was holding, and went about the day's work with the same settled certainty she brought to everything. I watched her and tried to find the seam between what she knew and what she was managing, and I could not find it. Either she had genuinely accepted this as the condition of the work, or she had built something so solid over the acceptance that the seam was no longer visible from the outside. I followed Rule 1 every night. I stayed inside. I logged everything. What I did not do was tell her how bad Rule 5 had gotten. The feeling had moved past low and persistent into something load-bearing. It was under everything. It was not that the animals were avoiding me. I was still getting images, still working the corridors, still producing the documentation the contract required. It was something underneath that, a sense that my presence in the drainage was being read, that the frame I was working in had a frame around it that I couldn't see, and something outside that larger frame was watching me work the way I watch the moose, with patience, with the specific attention of something that has decided you are worth tracking. I told myself this was the psychological effect of the calls, interrupted sleep and nocturnal stress producing paranoia in the field. Documented phenomenon, reasonable explanation. I was running out of reasonable explanations, and I knew it. On the 28th night, the calls stopped mid-sentence. I was at the table, log open, pen in hand. I had taken to writing the entries in real time, pen ready, because the details were coming faster than I could reliably reconstruct from memory. The voice had started at 12:08 a.m., South Perimeter, my name, and then Elena's name, and then a sentence I had said to Elena the last time we spoke that I will not write here. And then it stopped. Not at the end of the sentence. Mid-word. Cut. The silence after it was different from the usual silence. Fuller. The river was still there. The sedge was still there. But something that had been present underneath those sounds for 28 nights was suddenly absent, and the absence had a shape.
I looked at the east sensor display. The reading was flat. I looked at the other three, north, west, south, all registering normally. The east sensor was down.
I reached for my radio to run the check, and Vera's light came on. She appeared in the cook tent doorway in under a minute, radio already in hand, and looked at the sensor display before she looked at me. She said, "East sensor." I said yes. She picked up her radio and ran the diagnostic. The sensor was not malfunctioning. The signal was simply gone, the way a signal goes when something stands between the sensor and the receiver. Something was on the east boundary. She set the radio down. She reached for her jacket. I said, "The backup. Use the backup sensor from in here." She said, "The backup is on the east stake." I said, "Leave it." She looked at me. Then she looked at the tent door. She said, "I need to know if the boundary is holding." I said, "The rule says use the sensors from inside." She said, "The sensor is outside." She was already moving. I stood up. She crossed the cook tent in 4 steps and reached the door, and I was 2 steps behind her, and I said her name, and she stopped. She did not go outside. She stood in the doorway. The tent door was open, and she was standing in the opening with her radio in her hand and her eyes on the east tree line, and she was standing at the boundary in every way that mattered except the physical one. And the rule said standing at the edge, even inside the line, creates a presence that can be read from outside. And she was standing at the edge. I said, "Vera, step back." She didn't move. From the east tree line, her voice, not a recording of her voice, not an approximation, her voice, with the specific flat precision she put into everything, saying her own name back to herself. Vera. A pause. Then the same 2 words she had said to me on my first morning here. Just that. Her first words to me, in her own voice, from 30 meters past the boundary in the dark. She stood in the doorway and listened to herself. I put my hand on her arm. She came back inside. She came easily, not resistant, not frozen, just slow. The way you move when you are listening to something and don't want to stop hearing it. I pulled the door shut and zipped it from the inside. She sat down at the table. I sat across from her. She was present. Her eyes were focused. Her breathing was normal. She was sitting in the chair the way she always sat. But there was something in the quality of her stillness that was different from her usual stillness. Her usual stillness was active, the stillness of someone paying attention. This was the other kind, the stillness of something that has been set down. I said, "Vera." She looked at me. I said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I heard it." I said, "I know." She said, "It used my first words to you." I said, "I know." She looked at the equipment board, at the laminated sheet. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "I've never heard it use mine before." She said it the way you say something you have been holding for a long time and have finally put down. Not relief, just the particular weight of a thing that has been set on the table between 2 people. I sat with that. Outside, the east sensor came back online. The diagnostic read clean. The boundary was holding. Vera did not speak again that night. She sat at the table with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the middle distance. And I sat across from her and watched the sensor displays and listened to the river and the sedge and the spruce and thought about 3 seasons of a woman memorizing 5 rules with the precision of scripture and the thing those rules had never covered, which was what you do when it uses your own voice against you. In the morning, she ran the camp protocols the same as always, She checked the sensors, logged the overnight readings, started the stove. She moved through the routine with the same settled precision. But she did not look at the equipment board. In 3 weeks of watching her, she had looked at the laminated sheet every single morning. That morning, she did not. I noticed it, and I did not say anything. And that is the last thing I failed to do before everything else happened.
Vera was gone when I woke up. Her sleeping bag was cold. Not the cold of someone who left recently. The deep cold of fabric that hasn't been unoccupied for hours. Her boots were gone. Her jacket was gone. Her radio was on the equipment board on its charging mount, which was wrong, because Vera did not go anywhere without her radio. In 3 weeks, I had not seen her more than arm's reach from it. I checked the sensor displays. All 4 boundaries registering clean. Whatever had moved through the perimeter had not crossed it, or had crossed it in a way the sensors didn't register, which the rules implied was possible, and which I had been trying not to think about directly. I unzipped the tent door. The September morning was clear, cold, the sedge meadow catching the first flat light from the east. I stood at the cook tent door and scanned the camp. The equipment tent, the weather port, the marked route south to the river bar. Nothing. Then I looked at the south perimeter. Vera was standing 12 meters past the boundary line, facing the sedge meadow, her back to camp. Still. The particular active stillness I recognized, the kind that meant she was paying attention to something. She was standing the way she stood when she was watching an animal move through a corridor, weight balanced, head slightly forward, fully present. I said her name, not loudly, the way you say someone's name when you want to reach them without startling them. She turned. It was her face, her posture, her jacket, her boots, the radio-shaped absence at her chest where the radio should have been. She looked at me with Vera's eyes and said in Vera's voice, "Come look at this."
I stood at the tent door. "Come look at this," was what she said when she had something in the field worth seeing. She had said it to me 4 times in 3 weeks, each time with the same flat precision, and each time it had been worth looking at. My body knew the phrase. My body wanted to walk toward it. I looked down. The sedge between the camp boundary and where she was standing was pressed flat in a radial pattern. Not the linear compression of footprints, but a circular flattening, like something had been present in that space at low height, spread wide. No boot prints, no linear trail leading from the camp boundary to where she stood. She had not walked to that position. I looked back up at her face. I said, "What color is the blaze on the last marker you passed?" She said, "White." Immediately. No hesitation. No pause. No breath between my question and her answer.
The last marker on the route south was orange. I had checked it that morning. I had checked it every morning. I understood then what Rule 5 had actually been trying to tell me. The feeling was not about the work. The feeling was about being watched by something that was learning you, and I had given it 31 days. I stepped back inside the tent door. She said, "Owen, come look at this." I zipped the door. I sat down at the folding table and picked up Vera's radio from the charging mount and keyed the emergency frequency and gave my position and contract identifier and said I needed the float plane at the river bar as soon as possible and to please confirm. The confirmation came back in 4 minutes. 2 hours, weather holding. I sat at the table for 2 hours. The voice came twice more while I waited. Once from the south, Vera's voice. My name,
A pause. Then silence. Once from the east. Mara's laugh. Exact. Perfect. The sound of it so specific and so right that my hand was on the tent zipper before I understood what my hand was doing.
I took my hand off the zipper. I put both hands flat on the table. When I heard the float plane, I picked up my camera bag. Just the camera bag. Nothing else. And I walked out of the tent and across the camp to the marked route. And I kept my eyes on the path. And I walked south to the river bar without looking back. Behind me, from somewhere in the sedge, Mara's voice said, "You left your light on." I kept walking. The gravel bar was cold and white in the morning light, and Doug was already turning the plane on the water. And I climbed in, and he looked at the single bag and said nothing, and I was grateful for that, the way I had been grateful for it on the way in. And I did not look back at the tree line as we lifted off the river. From the air, I looked once. Vera was standing at the south perimeter, inside the boundary, still. The active stillness, the weight balanced, the full attention, watching the plane. I do not know if that was Vera. I have not known since.
Doug landed on the Soldotna River Strip at 8:40 in the morning and helped me tie down without asking questions, which told me he had flown people out of remote camps before and had learned what the single bag and the silence meant. I walked to the terminal building. It was a single room with 4 plastic chairs and a vending machine and a window that looked out at the river. I sat in one of the chairs. I put the camera bag on the floor between my feet. I looked at the window. A woman came in after a few minutes and asked if I was the Kenai contract. I said yes. She handed me a form to sign, equipment release, end of contract documentation, and I signed it, and she left, and I sat back down. I sat there for a long time. Eventually I stood up and went to the vending machine and bought a bottle of water I didn't want and drank half of it standing in front of the machine, and then sat back down. My hands were steady. I checked them twice because I needed to know. I called the project coordinator in Anchorage from the terminal's landline because my satellite phone was in the gear I'd left at camp. I told her the contract was complete, that I had evacuated due to a safety concern, and that the camp required a welfare check on the senior researcher. I used those exact words, welfare check, senior researcher, because they were the words that would produce the correct response from a project coordinator without requiring me to explain anything else. She said she would send someone. I said thank you and hung up.
I went back to the plastic chair. Outside, the river moved the way glacial rivers move. Gray-green, fast, with the specific indifference of water that has been moving for 10,000 years. And will be moving long after everyone in this terminal building is gone. I watched it for a while. Then I took my phone out of my jacket pocket. Not the satellite phone, my personal phone, which I had kept in my jacket the entire contract because there was no signal and therefore no reason to take it out. I turned it on. It found a cell tower. Notifications arrived in a stack I did not look at. I opened my contacts. I found Mara's name. I held the phone in both hands and looked at her name on the screen. I put the phone back in my jacket pocket. I picked up the camera bag and walked outside and found a cab and gave the driver the name of the nearest motel and sat in the back seat and watched Soldotna go past the window. Gas stations, a hardware store, a diner with a hand-lettered sign, and felt the specific relief of a place that had no interest in anything other than being a place. Ordinary, loud with traffic and propane smell and the sound of other people going about mornings that had nothing unusual in them. I checked into the motel. I sat on the bed. I took the laminated rules sheet out of my camera bag. I had taken it from the equipment board without deciding to,
The way your hand does things before your mind catches up. And I put it on the bed next to me and looked at it for a while. Then I lay down without taking off my jacket and closed my eyes. I did not dream about anything.
That was 4 months ago. I'm in Portland now. I photograph buildings, commercial architecture mostly, the occasional editorial assignment, empty lobbies, stairwells, facades in flat light. No subjects. I told my agent it was a new direction. She said the work was interesting and different and asked if I was okay. And I said yes, which was partly true, in the way that most things are partly true. I called Mara 3 weeks after I got back. She picked up on the second ring. She sounded like herself, older than I remembered, which is what happens when you don't talk to someone for 14 months and time moves without you. We talked for 22 minutes. I know because I watched the call timer. I did not tell her about Alaska. I told her I was sorry about the school play. She said she knew. We are going to try to have dinner when she visits her mother's sister in Portland in the spring. I am holding that like something breakable. I still have the laminated rule sheet. It lives in my camera bag, in the same plastic sleeve, and I check it sometimes when I am on a job and the light goes wrong in a way I can't account for, or a space feels different from how it should feel. I don't know what I'm checking for exactly. I think I'm checking that the rules are still the rules, that they haven't changed, that whatever is in that sheet is still what it was when someone wrote it down and relaminated it and taped it to an equipment board in a canvas tent in the Kenai drainage for the next person who needed to know.
Vera was not at the camp when the welfare check team arrived, 6 days after I left. The camp was intact, all equipment present, tent structure sound, sensor system operational. Her sleeping bag was there, her radio, her personal gear, her cooking equipment, cleaned and stacked. The project coordinator called me to confirm my account. I gave it. She asked if I had any information on Vera's whereabouts. I said no. She said they were treating it as a missing person case. She said these things sometimes had simple explanations. I said yes. I have not heard from the project coordinator since. I don't know if that means they found a simple explanation or if it means they stopped looking. I check the missing persons database for Kenai Peninsula Borough once a week. I have done this every week for 4 months. Her name has not appeared. I do not open my window at night anymore. I know what that's about. But the rules don't cover Portland, and I keep the sheet anyway. Marcus's card is in the kitchen drawer, where I put things I'm not ready to throw away. His handwriting, his signature. I read it 4 times, and I am almost certain it was him. Now I want to give you 3 rules, not all 5. The 3 that matter most if you ever find yourself in a place where the ordinary has started to feel like it's watching you.
The first one. If you hear a voice calling for help after dark and you cannot see the person, wait. Do not move toward it. Count to 3 minutes. A real person in real distress will keep calling, ragged, uneven, the way actual panic sounds. If it calls once and stops, it is not a person. Turn around, walk back. The third one. Do not stand at the edge. Not at a doorway, not at a boundary, not at the place where the safe space meets whatever is outside it. If you need to know what's out there, find a way to check that doesn't require your presence at the line. Standing at the edge creates something that can be read from the other side. This is the one rule that has no exception. The fifth one. If you begin to feel that something is wrong, not with the place, not with the situation, but with your own presence in it, like you are being watched in a way that is specific to you, report it to someone immediately. Do not spend more time alone trying to work it out. Do not tell yourself it is about the work or the stress or the sleep deprivation. This feeling is not about the work.
I know that now. I knew it on day 3, and I didn't say anything. And I gave it 28 more days to learn everything it needed. That is what I am confessing to you. That is the rule